Who is the new chair from the University of Michigan's Nuclear Engineering program. Now, sure, all of you know Todd in some capacity, one way or another, from prior engagements. Nonetheless, I still want to introduce him. So, Todd was actually in the nuclear navy before going to school, and got his undergrad degree at Northwestern University in 1984. And then later on at the University of Michigan, graduated in 97, and also worked then in INL's, at this time Argonne West, is that right?
Yep.
National Laboratory. And joined the University of Wisconsin as a faculty subsequently. Now, he then also led what was the Advanced Test Reactor User Program, which became later the Nuclear Science User Facilities Program, which it is today, so he founded that. And we all benefiting today in the nuclear engineering community. And then joined, became a senior fellow at Third Way in DC's think tank, supporting clean energy portfolio. And in between also as the deputy director of science and technology at the Idaho National Laboratory. And since January, the new chair of nuclear engineering, Michigan's nuclear engineering department. So Todd is going to tell us about the 21st century's nuclear energy. He's really spearheading this effort the last few years. Please, Todd.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for coming to talk. Appreciate it. I think lesson one from that bio is that if you start your career on a submarine, you totally lose control of the rest of your career. Yeah, I decided to call this 21st century nuclear energy. It's not necessarily, I mean, it's a bit Todd's view of the world, but I think it's me trying to get a sense of what's going on in the U.S. And I think it's a pretty interesting time relative to nuclear. Hopefully by the end of this, we'll convince you that. So let me start with this premise: nuclear energy is a big deal. I like this presentation. I found this graph recently, and in this figure, the purplish dots here are nuclear plants. And what I like about this one is they made the size of the dot based on how much energy you are putting out. So rather than putting the number of plants on the dot, it's the amount of electricity you're putting out. And if you do it this way, you see a lot of purple, right? So you guys know this because you're in this department, but we produce a lot of the nation's clean energy with nuclear right now. Okay. All right, modern energy systems, what's going on? So first premise is that we want energy. We want energy because in many parts of the world, this is people's lives. And it used to be this way in the West, but energy has stopped us from having to live this way. This is hard, it's backbreaking, it tends to fall on the backs of the females of the society, and it's awful. And when you have a chance to not do this, you don't want to go back. Okay? From energy, we get a lot of things. Here's a washing machine, but we get water purification, sanitation, all sorts of things that make our lives good. I don't think we will ever want to give those up. We may want to use them more efficiently, but I don't think we want to give them up. I argue quite frequently that other than getting married, there is no greater point of happiness in your life than when you get your first washing machine. Right? It's just a point of truth. You don't have to hang out at the laundromat anymore, and all that entails socially. Okay? All right, modern energy systems though are getting a little more complex. When I'm a kid, it's very simple. You make electricity at a central station power plant, you send it out via transmission and distribution lines, and it goes to the house. But lately we've got renewables and they're variables, so they're coming on and off the grid, and we're balancing that with plants that load follow or demand response. And the system has gotten much more complicated, but that also offers the opportunity for different types of energy products, right? So in this complication, there is also opportunity. And when you think about the opportunity, what drives people's choices, right? Well, cost matters. This is a figure I stole from the University of Tennessee. They've got an online calculator. You can put in certain premises about tax policy and other things, and it'll tell you what's the cheapest form of electricity in various parts of the country. In this snapshot, I just like it because it shows, depending on where you live, the cheapest form can be very different. Right? So in some places where it's flat and you've got a lot of wind, that may be the cheapest. In some places where it's sunshiny like Arizona, that may be. In this calculation, the blue dots are where nuclear would be the most cost competitive. My point is, it's not all the same in every place, and therefore there are opportunities for products if you can figure out where your product will sell. Okay? I think another trend we have to think about is where people live. The world becomes more and more urbanized, right? So you're trying to pack large numbers of people into small places, and that may change the way you deliver energy, right? So if you happen to be a fan of solar and distributed, but you're packing tons of people into a small amount of area, you may have to come up with a different energy system to support that as opposed to in a more rural existence, right? So location of people, the location of the energy sources relative to those people is a big deal, or it's a consideration. People will worry about jobs. This is not meant to be a trend, it's just a snapshot that I found in a recent article. It just shows at any given time, some energy technologies are supporting less jobs. In this case, coal and nuclear were losing jobs as with solar, and others are gaining, right? Gas, bioenergy, other, I'm not remembering what other is, but apparently it's a good job opportunity. Son, what are you going to work on? I'm pretty much thinking I'm going to do other. Another thing is the cleanliness of the energy source, right? We as humans demand over time that things get cleaner. This is one of my favorite graphs. A professor at the University of Rochester came out with it a few years ago. And I think it's informative because it's very simple. It's along the x-axis, it's the year. And along the y-axis, it's the intensity of how much carbon per gigajoule of energy are you putting out. And it just shows over time we get cleaner. Right? This graph does not tell you why. It does not tell you about policy choices. It just says over time we get cleaner. Right? We go from animal dung to burning wood to coal to oil to natural gas to nuclear. That's the trend that we're on. I don't think that changes. And I do think at the moment we're in this debate about how fast can you possibly go. Right? Is the fact that induced buildup of carbon in the atmosphere is driving climate change? Are we going to respond to that, and how fast? Right? That forces you to ask some questions about honest accounting. For those of you that have not found this figure or this website, you can go online and it will show you at any time the carbon intensity of countries. Right? This happens to be a snapshot of Europe, the first generation of this this model in Europe, but I think it does worldwide now. You can see the US and Canada. And it's very informative, right? If you do not like carbon in the atmosphere, it's the green places on the map. And the green places on the map shows that the countries that have low carbon output have some combination of hydro and nuclear, right? And that's France and the Nordic countries. The ones that are black or brown, or the closer to a dark color, is where you're producing a lot of carbon. So Poland is particularly bad, Germany quite a bit. I point this out because I think that people care about the amount of carbon that you put out. I also think that people, and I don't agree with this, but they tend to fall into technology camps, right? Whereas I think the answer is you limit carbon. Some people are in love with certain technologies, and Germany is a prime example, and I think this is some interesting data. Germany has said, we as a country care about reducing climate, and we are going to do that by shifting to renewable energy. And they have been extremely effective at putting more nuclear on their grid. That's the blue dots. And over time, you get larger and larger fraction of their energy comes from renewables. Unfortunately, if you look at the carbon output for the same period of time, it's not really changing much, because they made a decision to shut down their nuclear plants. Right? And they're shutting down their nuclear plants. They're keeping going or restarting their coal plants. They happen to have particularly dirty coal in Germany. The point is, I think we need to have honest accounting around carbon. The other thing about honest accounting is you shouldn't be allowed to offshore your carbon, right? You can say I have a very extremely clean process, and all you've done is shifted your dirty production to some country overseas. You should not get credit for doing that. And I think that I found this in a study recently, and a lot of calculations, statements about cleanliness do not look at full system effects and the supply chains and manufacturing chain. I think resilience will matter. People do not want the electricity to go off, correct? And it's not just that you get ticked because your laundry stops halfway through the load. I think there's more important things like that, like it stops in the middle of your favorite TV show. Now, but we do care, right? You do want the electricity to stay on and to come back quickly. So designing systems that are resilient to change and will be there when you need them is an important part of energy delivery. The system that you get your electricity in matters. So this is about 5 years old, so the exact data is not going to be correct. But there was an article in Forbes, and it was talking about the Danish wind miracle, because Denmark is trying very hard to use as much wind as they can. They get a lot of wind in Denmark. But it really talked about how do you buffer that intermittent wind. And the way they did it is that they've got big electricity pipes that go up to the Nordic countries and then go down into Europe, right? So if you've got some way to backstop your variability, you're okay, but you have to make sure that whatever you're backstopping with is also clean, or that you're being honest about your accounting, right? At this point in time, the Danish system would not work, right, if they didn't have the big electricity pipes north and south. The other part about the systems that I think is good is to recognize where you're getting your electricity from. I just found this the other day from the Energy Information Agency, and it says certain states in the U.S. import a lot of electricity. Others are actually exporters. And so I only point this out in that if you are an importer, right, you need to make sure that you're correctly accounting for how that electricity is being produced when you're calculating your carbon. Right? Or in the case of California, they do have input from the big nuclear plants in Arizona. And sometimes, it's actually a funny story. This is an eye-opener for me. So, of course, here, when your renewable resources are going great, you actually have excess. And there are times where you are actually paying the state of Utah to take your excess electricity for you. Right? If you didn't know that, there's a utility exec in Utah who I listened to him give a speech, and he's quite amazed that people will give him money and electricity at the same time. You Californians are generous people. But the point is, in the end, it's the system that matters. And I'll finish this intro section with what they did in Ontario. Ontario said we are going to get rid of coal. They said this around 2003. They shut down their last coal plant in 2014. Important in this story is, if you look at this is the pre-shutdown, so they still have coal. If you look at the mix afterwards, in practical application, for Ontario to get to zero coal, it required a large amount of nuclear and a large amount of hydro. Right? And so, hopefully, at this point, you're willing to at least accept the argument that nuclear is a necessary component in the system if you're going to decarbonize in an efficient way. And I think that that's true, right? So if that's true, then let's talk a little bit about nuclear. So I'm going to start with opinions first and technology later, right? So back in the 1950s, right, nuclear was the it technology. People were very excited about nuclear. Louis Strauss was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission in those days, and he's got this quote he's famous for. People generally remember this part, the energy too cheap to meter part. My understanding, he was actually talking about fusion at the time. The quote has sort of been used to describe nuclear more generally by people who typically don't like nuclear. But if you read his entire quote, he was counting on a lot from this technology, right? Not only would it be too cheap to meter, we will know of no more great periodic regional famines. There's going to be a matter of history. We'll travel effortlessly over the seas, through the air with a minimum of danger and at great speeds. Our lifespans will get longer, disease will go away. This is going to be awesome, right? And in the beginning, the technology really took off, right? If you look at the build rate of nuclear, sort of in the 70s to 2000, this was about 30 nuclear plants per decade, right? And this is a very good rate. And we got up to that, and then around 2000-ish, right, it plateaued. Right, it plateaued, and we've sort of been at 20% of the nation's electricity since then. Last couple of years, we've started to shut down a few of the older plants, so we're coming off that plateau a bit. But I'll say that in many ways, this looks like a normal product development curve, right? You have a new product, people get excited about it, it takes off, and then eventually it reaches some plateau because it's delivered what the market will accept. And that market is a combination of the technology, the cost, the policies around it, and what people want to buy. I should point out that Louis Strauss is not the only person who was ever super exuberant about a technology. Here's William Stanley Jevons, who was a 19th century British economist who loved coal, right? In the context of now, this seems silly, right? But if you look at it, it sounds a lot like Strauss, right? You know, we're going to have a material with miraculous powers. Like, we will never need anything better than coal. It will never be superseded, the wonderfulness of coal, right? It's the best source of power as air, water, gold, iron, or each for its own purposes, right? And so like, and I didn't bring it for this set of slides, but I've got a follow-on to this of my exuberant renewable energy speakers, right? Every generation has one. I personally do not believe there's a perfect technology. My sense is that it is a mixture of technologies, each bringing its own benefit, that end up making up the system. Very similar to what Ontario did in getting rid of coal. So over the years, how did the conversation change around nuclear? So we'll start at Lewis Strauss, too cheap to meter. By the 1990s, when I was brilliant enough to decide to go to grad school in nuclear engineering, and Bill Clinton terminated all funding for nuclear energy research and development, John Kerry, who was a senator at the time, who was part of the push to get rid of the nuclear programs, basically said advanced nuclear is irresponsible. And I didn't bring the longer quote, but he said, in every way, economically, from a safety standpoint, from a proliferation standpoint, he had nothing good to say about advanced nuclear. If you fast forward 20 years, so now we're sort of on a plateau, this is John Kerry. He's clearly wiser now because his hair is gray. But in the context of climate change now, he's making a speech that says, there are no other alternatives. So you're going to have to include advanced nuclear in the mix. And quite frankly, he was a little bit shifty the way he talked about it, because if you look at the quotes and you weren't a nuclear engineer, you wouldn't realize he was talking about the same thing he hated 20 years ago. But climate has brought many people back into the conversation that had dismissed nuclear and felt that it was a technology we did not need. Usually when they said that previously, they were willing to accept coal. Many people are not now. People are wanting to get away from fossil fuels. So it's brought many people back into the conversation about nuclear. In about the last year to 6 months, that conversation has turned in a pretty amazing way. And these are just some examples. So the Nature Conservancy came out with their How Do We Get to Zero Carbon portfolio. And the Nature Conservancy said you're going to need a component of nuclear power to do that. Right? Google did a study on 24/7 carbon-free energy. They said you're going to need nuclear to do that. The MacArthur Foundation, which is a big foundation, who has funded work in nuclear, but it's always been around nuclear security and safeguards, got together with Exelon, who's the utility with the biggest nuclear footprint in the US, and they wrote a joint paper saying we need to work together if we're going to address climate. The Clean Energy Ministerials is a government-to-government set of deliberations, discussions that were started in the Obama administration, which for the first 8 or 9 years, nuclear was not allowed in the discussion. Starting last year, the US, Canada, and Japan formed what's called the NICE initiative, and I forgot what that stands for. Nuclear Innovation in Clean Energy, something like that.
It's underneath.
Did I get that right?
It's underneath.
That's pretty hilarious. Once you get to be tenure, none of this matters. You just yammer away. People are fine. But anyway, the point is, nuclear is now in these intergovernment discussions. And then finally, Union of Concerned Scientists, who have never been big fans of nuclear, always saying, we're not against nuclear, but it can never be safe enough, and therefore we don't really like it. They came out with a paper that said, all right, we may not be convinced about advanced nuclear, but please don't shut down the existing plants because we don't know how to make that up yet, right? So a big turning point around. So I think we're at a point in the conversation where people want to talk about nuclear, right? And it's a question about what can the nukes bring them relative to products. I think the policy environment matters, and I just want to show a couple things here. One, at certain times the US gets more excited about funding energy than others. So you look at this giant peak here, where you're doing a ton of nuclear, some coal, some renewables. This was post-oil embargo, 1970s. For those of you that used to live through it, waiting in line for hours to get gas is not fun. But we came off a peak and we sort of had this steady state, sort of lower level research for a while. In the last sort of decade, primary focus on renewables. Coal's always hanging around in there, less and less for nuclear. I think there's some success here, right? When go back 20 years ago, the story around renewables, it was always going to be too expensive, wasn't going to work. The Obama administration made a big push through portfolio standards and other things. Prices are coming down, it's more viable. So I think there's value in that. But I think right now a lot of people would argue that we don't do enough energy research. Maybe the balance is off. But most interesting to me, and I didn't understand this until about a year ago, I found this study that looked at, for all the government spending in energy, for about a 65-year period, how was it spent? We can spend it on R&D, we can spend it on tax policy, we can do a lot of different things. And it turns out that the things that get deployed a lot, oil, natural gas, renewables, it's always a mix of some R&D and some tax policy. Some things that are asking you to invent new things, and some things that ask you to do commercial competition that brings the prices down. If you look at the nuclear bid, it's all R&D. It's all R&D, right? There's been this expectation from the nuclear community that we do enough research, that a magical product would come out, and people would just buy it, and it just hasn't happened, right? So one of my sort of arguments now in public policy space is we need to change that balance. I'm not anti-R&D, I'm a researcher by nature, or by training. I think it's by training, right? I don't even read the slides well by nature. But the point is, right, I think we need to figure out how to incentivize commercial competition in addition to the R&D if we're going to drive prices down and do the kind of things that get things into the market. Another thing in public policy space that's interesting, this is pretty unreadable, sorry about that, I'll just talk about it. A paper came out within the last year that looked at how much money foundations spend on energy and environment studies. It's about $500 million a year. It's a lot of money. Very little ever touches nuclear, right? And what does is usually around nuclear security and safeguards, right? So there is not in the non-federally funded part of the world where people are funding studies in energy, there's not much energy in nuclear. And that's something we have to work on. I think some of these conversations about needing nuclear to address climate change starts to bring some of those people into the discussion. All right, so I think the opinions are changing. So comment number one, the energy systems are more complex. This opens opportunities for different types of products. Item number two, the conversation around nuclear is definitely changing in a positive way if you like nuclear. How about technology, right? So I'll go back to this slide and notice again, we got this plateau, right? And I will argue that this plateau is some combination of technology, right? There's a certain market demand that the technology can fit, right? So for instance, all of our nuclear energy plants are large, gigawatt scale electricity production, right? So if I was to go into, say, a growing country in Africa, that would be too big. It would make no sense, right? So there are certain points where the technology just does not match what's needed. The economics matter. People don't want to pay too much. Sometimes they will pay for more for it than a market would drive it down to. And Germany is a good example. They pay more for the electricity in order to put all the renewables on the grid, but they made a choice as a country to do that. But the price matters. There's a policy environment that affects what gets put on the grid, right? So renewable portfolio standards are saying we are going to use this many renewables, no matter what. That influences what gets put on the grid. And the last one is social license, right? And I'll get back to this, which is how acceptable is your technology to the general public? And this is one of the things where I don't think that the nuclear engineering community has done well at. And I think in the end, I will argue we still don't do well, right? You get funded to do R&D. We're technologists, right? And I think it's going to be through some clever partnership with social scientists that will make a difference. But let's start with talking about technology. So you're sitting on this plateau. You started to lose a few plants. And I think a lot of people are debating, are we at a cliff, right? Are we just going to start shutdowning plants? There will never be a new product, and that's the end of nuclear, right? Kind of hard for me to believe that, especially if I look at other countries, right? But there's this argument, are we at a cliff? Or are we at an inflection point where different kinds of products, which will change this mix of technology, economics, maybe driven by changes in policy, maybe driven by improvements in social license, that actually lead to a different type of products and either the same or more use. And like simple little example of why I think this matters. So I'll use cars as an example, right? I live in near Detroit now, so cars matter. Although, if you've been there, clearly somebody has made an agreement. The car manufacturers have made an agreement with the government to never fix potholes so you would destroy your car and buy another car. It has been that way since I was a kid. Anyway. But if you think about cars, I think about when I was growing up and there was a Soviet Union, and we would see these stories, right, from the Soviet Union, like East Germany, if you wanted a car, you got to drive the Trabant. That was it, right? That's what you got. That's what you made. And like, here in the US, it's like you go to the Detroit Auto Show and like, you want a small car that's gas efficient, you can buy one. If you want a car that hauls around you, your children and their 17 soccer playing friends, you can buy one. If you want to haul stuff in a small truck, you can. And you need a big truck, right? And you have sort of options, right? But in nuclear, we've always had this one product, right? Gigawatt scale electricity. And there's a reason in regulated utility markets, but the world's changing, right? And I think we need different types of products. The other reason I like this slide is some people are like good at like going to a party and remembering jokes and stuff. I am not. I only remembered one joke, but it's embedded in this slide, so I will try it. Do you know, and it always works with young people because these German Trabants are so long ago, you're like, I don't even know this stuff. Do you know why they put rear window defoggers on the Trabant?
Keep your hands warm.
Keep your hands warm when you're pushing. Exactly. All right. So I think the point I'm trying to make is, you know, the customer doesn't want to buy your Trabant if they have a Camry. We're at this point in time where different types of products in nuclear, it may be the right time to think about this. Okay. So what's going on in nuclear? Well, we've got just less than 100 existing plants. Most of them churning along, producing the largest fraction of carbon-free electricity that the U.S. has. We've got some plants, and they're the red ones here, that have shut down. Prematurely relative to their technology age, that they were running fine, but the economics locally to them, the utilities couldn't justify owning them. And there's a number that are threatened. That's the yellow ones, right? At the same time, what I consider to be a sort of a near miracle is that we now have entrepreneurial nuclear. There are roughly 75 or so privately funded companies, some big, some small, some you never heard of, some are run by Bill Gates, all thinking they've got the next nuclear product, right? If it's truly an entrepreneurial culture, most of them will fail, and we should be fine with that, right? But hopefully some fraction of them rise up and become a commercial product. And what's nice about it is they're thinking beyond gigawatt scale. Some of them are thinking a megawatt or to 10 megawatts, but still electricity. Some of them are thinking about process heat or district heat or different things that you could do with a nuclear plant, right? And I think that's all very healthy, and hopefully you get a new product. We have to be able to help them. So some things we increasingly do poorly, and I think this is because we've acted like we don't care. But this graph just is an example, and it's how hard do we make it to export our technology? And in this case, it's the processing time to get an 8-10 agreement. It's like permission for the government to sell something overseas to another country. And you just look at the processing time, and we keep making it harder and harder and harder. And in the 1950s, Eisenhower, Atoms for Peace days, where we were the prime source of nuclear technology, right? You got it from the US or you didn't, you could be super picky. But now we're competing with the Russians, we're competing with the Chinese, the Koreans are selling plants to people we used to. Like if we can't design processes to allow our vendors to actually succeed in international commerce, right, we won't, right? We may still want nuclear, but we'll end up buying it from our Korean colleague. I just recently found this data, and I find it really fascinating. So EPRI did a study on government cost share. You know, when the government is cost shared with industry to do nuclear deployment. It's operated, so once you built the thing, how long did it operate versus government cost share? And these are all the commercial BWRs. And I find it fascinating that there's sort of a trend here that the less money the government ended up putting into the project, the less money that the government put into the project, the longer it operated. So there's a certain, allow people that are good at operating plants to do that, right? And allow them to build enough of them and gain experience, right, to get good at operating them. That's a benefit. A lot of demonstrations, it kind of doesn't matter how much the government put into it, right? They tried some stuff, it didn't become a commercial product. And then with Fermi 1, the government didn't put much into it. Detroit, Edison decided to build a sodium-cooled fast reactor, and they just had an operational problem that forced them to shut it down. So I sort of consider this one a one-off with a new technology. But for me, the answer is, new technologies are good, but you need to get enough. You need to get commercial confidence and enough of them that you get operational experience and bring the price down and stuff. So, well, I like the fact that there are new technology possibilities. I do think that you need some of them to become the market winners, otherwise they'll never get good at what they do. The last thing I want to point out relative to this is we have competition, right? The Chinese are building lots of plants indigenously. They are taking, they were very clever, they built sort of one of everything. Okay, US let us build one of your AP1000s, and Europe, let us build one of your EPRs, and Canada, can-dos. But they sign these contracts where if they then change like roughly 5% of the design, it's now an indigenous Canadian design, and they can just, I mean, Chinese design, and they can sell it, right? So they clearly are setting up to be exporters. The Russians want to be exporters. They do a lot of things where they will tell a country they will pay for the reactor, they will operate it, they will take the spent fuel, as long as you sign up a 100-year contract, right, for them to provide you with energy, which, on the one hand, it's a good deal for energy, but you give up a lot of autonomy over your energy system to the Russians, right? And so it is a concern, right, that we figure out how to compete in international commerce lest we cede the field. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is the social license part of this, and I'll call it the talking about nuclear energy. This is a graphic, came out way back in the 1960s. It talks about sort of citizen participation in engagement in sort of big projects, right? And the general, then these are sort of cartoon versions of society, but in the 1950s and 1980s, people were much more willing to let a industry or the government come in and do something. And the idea was you sort of, as a company, you build what you want and you sort of try to placate the people afterwards, right? But we're industry, we're good at it, we'll take care of the situation. And the community sort of had no or little power. You go into the 1970s and people got very distrustful of big industry and the government, and nuclear's rollout was right at the intersection of big industry and the government, and it's been a problem for us ever since, but you sort of consulted with people and then you build it if the economic imperative outweighs the public outcry, and then people sort of deal with it. And I think the worry now is that people are becoming much more sophisticated, right? You look at pipeline controversies or electrical grid controversies, and people want to know what the value is, right? So I like thinking about an electrical grid. If you're the person producing power on this end, you like somebody building the grid because you can then transmit it to somebody who's going to buy it. So that's good for you. If you're on the other end, you're the user. It's good, right? You're getting this energy, and you can put it to good, effective use. If you're in the middle, it's just a power line going through your backyard. You don't get paid for it, right? It's just some risk, some annoyance, and no benefit, right? And I think people are getting more and more sophisticated about this. I think it's going to be a big deal figuring out how to convince people that you are providing value to their community. And their community is not a single place. It is a cluster of communities all with different needs. I think that's part of what drives this idea towards microgrids and local control. And it gets back to me, I'm currently somewhat puzzled about how you do a mega city, and we're getting more and more of those, where you also have local control of your power system, right? And how you do that, especially if you insist that you can only do it with renewables, right? I'm more and more believing that apartment complexes are going to need to have like small nukes in the basement, but that's just me. All right. So why did we get into this issue of our communications? Well, part of it in the 1950s is people were first introduced to nuclear via weapons tests. That's the first thing they learned, right? And the Eisenhower administration recognized that they were in competition with the Soviets, who were also building weapons. But the Soviets were also saying, well, we're going to use this technology to do good things, right? And they did not want to cede that argument. Because in the early days, nuclear technology was closely held by the government, right? They did not want anyone else to know what was going on with this technology. So Atoms for Peace came out, and they basically said, we want to use this technology for the good of mankind, right? And all sorts of initiatives going on, right? So as part of the story is, this can be good for you. But at the same time, like, we're asking people to build bomb shelters, right? To go ride out the storm of the fallout of the nuclear weapons. And children are doing these duck and cover exercises where you had to get under your desk so the fallout didn't fall on you. So it's no wonder that parents were confused. And it showed up in popular culture, right? So this is very typical of the monster movies of the 50s, right? And the theme, okay, in this case, the story is there's a giant spider. That's, in case you, the story is that the spider is giant and threatening, not that the people were shrunk. Right, so, but the point of the thing was it was supposed to be like an allegory on society, right? The spider was caused because technologists, in this case nuclear people, lost control of their technology and radiation created this giant spider which is terrorizing society. And then in the story, the lady in the hat are the citizens, right, that are being threatened, and the guy with the hat and the gun is the protector, right? And I think the environmental groups of the 70s that were anti-nuclear protesters viewed themselves as protectors of society. But that's what you saw on TV, right? I mean, that's sort of how people learned about the nuclear rollout. And I think if you did not live close to a nuclear facility, if you had no reason to be close to this technology, then it's easy for you to believe, right, that this is a technology that should give you the willies. You should be nervous about it. You know, my first job, I was, Peter said, I was on a submarine, right? I lived on a floating submarine, so I have a different perspective about the risk of this, but most people do not have that opportunity, right? And therefore do not know. I think pop culture is a little vicious. I think you start to see it coming around. So I found a couple just to know it's not just us, right? But here's a couple poking at the renewables folks. So solar cooked hot dogs should be ready in about 3 hours. If you got time. If Greenpeace ruled the world, that would be mobility. And my favorite, I love this one. Just wait for the gust, it's coming. The trees are rustling over there. Give it a chance, my friend. But my point, right, is I'm starting to see stuff like this, right, in pop culture, where people, they will rightly make fun of you if you're making a claim that does not justify your enthusiasm. That said, the renewables people have been great about talking about their technology. So a little exercise I went through. I was at this conference called Advanced Energy. It's a New York State energy conference. They had a program called Reforming the Energy Vision. It was very much about renewables, distributed generation. And they were rolling out this $150 million green bank, right? They were going to do projects funded by New York State. And my exercise was to listen to the plenary speakers. And I just wrote down, how did they talk about the technology? And this is what they said, and it's very, very positive, right? We're going to transform the energy economy while protecting jobs, supporting people. Incredible ideas coming out of our universities, right? So this will touch you in a real way because it's going to affect your kids. Wave after wave of demos. Communities will lead these projects. All New Yorkers will participate, right? So, you know, low income, moderate income, you will all benefit. Resilience matters. Start with the customer. Think big, start small, scale fast. It's all very positive, right? It's all very personal. It's very positive. This will make your life better. That's the way they talk about their technology, right? Then I think about me listening to nuclear engineers over the years, right? And it's, you know, you get some people like, okay, people, listen. All right, I got your sources. I got your coal, petroleum, biomass, natural gas, nuclear. I got my deaths per terawatt. We're not the effing problem. And like the message, right? The message is nuclear. We kill less people than you think. Like, how on earth can that be your slogan, right? I mean, your slogan should be about clean jobs and what's in the community and demos come out of your university. All the language they have figured out, right? But we have chosen for odds reasons to act like technologists, right? And that what people want to hear from us is that we will fix the problems that we think bother them. But like no one markets a technology that way. Like Boeing, you should get on the new 787 because we were less likely to crash than the last thing we were flying. And no one markets that way, right? And so I came up with this slide. Apologies to Kelsey because I'm sure you've seen this before. It's my proposing marriage slide, right? Let's imagine I'm going to propose marriage to you. I'm going to do it, right? And I say, look, I want you to marry me. Be my spouse. Because compared to anyone else you've ever dated, I'm not as dumb, I'm not as cheap, I'm not as ugly, and I'm not as smelly, right? How many of you say yes? I mean, you just wouldn't do it, right? It's like the worst proposal ever. But then I think, and I'm guilty here because I was part of the Gen 4 roadmap, we put this in the little language about what a modern nuclear energy system should be, and we said it's not as dangerous, it's not as expensive, it's not going to be as big a waste problem, and it's not as big a proliferation risk, right? And like, why would I get excited about that, right? All you've done is make me more nervous about the thing I was already slightly nervous about, right? And so I love the technology gains. I think they're important. I think there are new market opportunities. People are addressing them, right? I think there are challenges in public policy, but the public policy is, the world is coming around to being supportive of nuclear. Bills are passing in Congress, presidents are signing into law things that are positive for the nuclear energy. I think that the technology companies will drive the costs down because they have to. I think the regulator is starting to at least publicly admit they need to be ready to regulate new types of technologies. I'm not sure we're figuring out the social license part, right? And I hesitate whenever I give this talk, because the last thing I want is to excite a bunch of nuclear engineers to run out and be awkward about this, right? In a way that makes people even more nervous, right? But in those cases where it makes sense, you're hanging out with friends at the bar, you get into a conversation, lead with your benefits, right? So I should have pointed something out. So I'm going to back up. I forgot to say something when I was back here. And we can go through the cartoons again. But I was given, when I first found this slide, right, I'm talking about the pop culture, somebody in the audience said, hey, do you know who that guy in the hat is? I'm like, I have no idea. It's the back of a guy, right? I'm thinking, like, how would you recognize people from their backside? Anyway, he said, that's James Arness, right? And this may be a tool of reference for you, but James Arness was famous when I was young for a show called Gunsmoke. He was a cowboy, right? He was the sheriff. And he would come into town, and every week there's some bad guy would run the thing, and James Arness was the sheriff that saved everyone. So that's interesting. And as I thought about that, this is still super funny, by the way. As I thought about that, I thought maybe the closing message for this talk is, this is James Arness, right? This is James Arness in Gunsmoke, right? And I think the challenge to you all, right, is you need to stop being the spider in the story, right? You need to be James Arness, right? You need to convince people that relative to climate change and clean energy jobs and stuff, nuclear is the hero in the story and not the giant spider, right? So I will leave you with that. I am clearly very hopeful for advanced nuclear, but I do think we have some work to do. And I am glad to answer any questions you have if I have not stunned you into silence at this point.
All right, any questions?
Yeah, the only question I know was, you give that speech and they still let you be the chair of the department? You clearly have no standards.
Any questions for Todd?
So, Todd, thank you so much. I apologize I came in a bit late, but so I was at the APS conference a couple of weeks ago, and an old friend was there, somebody I respect, but he also annoys me a great deal, and I think he's doing a lot of harm. It was Amory Lovins, Rocky Mountain Institute. He's a very smart man. He talks fast. In a 30-minute talk, he normally will show about 100 slides. One gets the impression he does his research, but one gets a feeling that beneath the surface, he's misusing information. And I think, and he is not a friend. I mean, his message nowadays is that we can do all this, make a profit, do it at the neighborhood level, and everything is copacetic without nuclear. And he's a very influential voice. What do we do about Amory Lovins?
So, my thought, and it gets back to this thing here, as I was anticipating your question, is that I think every technology sits on one of these, right? I just don't buy that there's a single technology that has a combination of technology and economics and policy and social license that you can go to 100%. And I see tons of studies, right? I mean, just intuitively, as I get closer and closer to 100% renewables, right? That means I've got some component of that system that rarely gets used. Who is the owner of that system, right? I mean, I see people that do the complex economic calculations and do this more rigorously than what I just said, but I cannot imagine anyone who wants to own the thing that rarely gets used to fill in the last, to make it 100%. I also think because they're here on the curve, they are totally ignoring their own social license questions, right? You start to see it already. Like, there was just an article in, was it the Washington Post yesterday? But it was doing a recap of Bureau of Land Management decisions on how much energy infrastructure you can put on publicly owned lands, right? And there's this debate because if you are a solar developer, where you would like to put your utility scale solar plant may not be the place that for conservation reasons, for other reasons, that other people want you to put this down, right? I remember there was a case in New England, I think it was, local community set a tax advantage for solar, right? But they didn't ask the question, where are the best locations for solar in our community? Well, after they passed it and the developers came in, it turns out it was their agricultural land, right? They were imagining you would put the solar, I don't know, on the roofs or the cliff sides, but the cheapest place to put it down was their best agricultural land, right? So I think you try to get to 100%. You run into transmission line issues because you're going to move a lot of electricity, right? You run into where you're putting all this stuff. It's conflicting with other needs. I just don't think there's something there, and I just don't believe anyone. Like, I don't believe that there are people in the nuclear community that are shouting on Twitter that you only need nuclear, right? And everyone else should just shut up. Right? This is why Twitter is annoying, right? But it's nonsense, right? For all these reasons why nuclear struggled to get past the 20%, I don't see how we get to 100. And whenever, I don't care if it's Mark Jacobson or Amory Lovrins, I have a reflexive, when I hear somebody that confident in their own self, that there's something missing. I just don't believe it. And it's hard for me, and I think of so many people who come around, right? Who are in the 100% camp, but then study it a bit and thoughtfully think about how to do this, and they rarely stay in the 100% camp unless they're a celebrity, right? Who's I mean, it's a harsh thing to say, but in a certain sense, there's a celebrity image that's tied up in the story, right? That's very hard to abandon once that's your thing. That's why I've tried very hard not to ever be a celebrity. Yeah.
I hope I didn't misunderstood you. There is difference between a politician and an engineer, I hope. So politicians could say anything, promise anything, say great things about whatever and never deliver.
Yep.
In our case, we are in a way limited because we want our presentation to be based on facts. We want to deliver things. So we cannot lie that obviously and say, okay, we are promising God knows what.
Right.
And again, I debated maybe 10, 15 years ago some crazy non-nuclear supporters or anti-nukes in California. You have a lot of them. But what would you say if they claim, in front of 100 people, every single nuclear reactor is bomb and it will explode, and Diablo Canyon will explode? And again, they can say anything, but for me to say, no, it will not explode, I need to explain, the facts, the physics, engineering, and all of that. It doesn't work. So we are kind of losing the fact.
Yeah, but I think sometimes, so clearly, right, we have to tell the truth, right? There's no question about that. I think part of it is, depending on the conversation, those deep technical details are important. In some conversations, they're too much, right? So they're fine in an engineer-to-engineer discussion. And so I think in a case like that, it's, I think as soon as you try to delve into the technical details, you soon lose the audience. You see this, right? Because they can't quite follow what you're talking about. But the story is, no, it can't, right? I mean, if that's what a bomb looked like, right, then why is the U.S. Navy not driving around with those things to launch at other countries? I mean, it's just a silly argument, right? I guess I would mock their false superiority.
Maybe first Jeff and then Max.
I didn't actually have a question, but I do remember something I saw in negotiations a while ago that is principally, they're not interested in a fact-based argument, so don't make claims that are false, but also don't engage with that narrative in the first place, and try to come around to a set of arguments that you can both agree on, and then hopefully you will have a chance.
No way to come up with anything
Not with that
that you
attitude.
agree.
Well, I think there's two stories, right? There are some people that are going to be hard over skeptics, and you'll never get to it. But I think most people don't really know that much about it, right? And I think the point there is, don't lead with what are you concerned about, right? When you think about an energy system, what do you want in your community, and bring them into the discussion that way, and then talk about, well, here's what we can do with nuclear. I think there are some things, and then they'll have some questions about issues, and you just talk them through that, right? So was Bob next or something?
No, Max. And then Paul.
Max and Bob?
Max
right here.
Oh,
You showed a slide where you showed nuclear. There's been a lot of R&D and
Yeah.
delivery of products. Now we have all these startups,
Yeah.
and I feel that many of them they are following the same path. A lot of R&D, but we really haven't seen products. What it's going to take to see the products?
So I think it's things like a clean energy portfolio standard, right? Or commitments from the government at military bases, DBAs, to purchase certain kinds of technologies, right? Or a tax incentive for building something, right? I think those are kind of things that the nuclear community has never asked for, that incentivize commercial competition, and it worked for solar, right? It worked. There was money to be made. There was commercial competition. They drove the prices down, and we've never really operated that way, right? The first plants came out of government programs with a lot of government support. It was a regulated utility market. You could do that there, and we've never tried anything other than that. So that's what I think has to happen. Okay, Bob. Bob, you're always like a very skeptical, good questioner, so I've been trying to avoid you. But apparently Peter's not going to let me do it.
I actually think that there's only one parameter that matters in the next 10 years or 30 or 50, and that's how much it's going to cost. Let me defend that point. There are places where the nuclear reactors of the future are practically free. They'll never build them, for sure. There are just places like that. I come from one, right? I mean, we're a nuclear-free zone, right? But there are plenty of places in the United States, and certainly elsewhere, where the only thing that matters is they cost too much right now. And if the cost was competitive, they build them today. And in fact, we saw that only within the last decade. I can show you a slide from 2012, only 7 years ago, that showed 35 utility orders for new plants in the United States, and they were large ones.
Yep.
Why did they go away? It was entirely because of cost. I mean, there was nothing else. Except for Diablo, all the other shutdowns in the rest of the country have to do with cost. So I want to stipulate the following condition, that if the new reactor vendors can get the cost down, they will sell reactors in enough places in the United States to make a huge dent in the total U.S. electricity market. Not everywhere, but enough places. I can even tell you where some of them are. But, I don't know where they all are, but I know a lot of people were there because they were ordering plants only 7 years ago. So that's our challenge. Arguing with Amory Lovins doesn't do anything for me, particularly for me because I know him well enough. But there are people like that. I don't care whether they tell the truth or they're people with honorable convictions that are opposed. That's fine with me. But we shouldn't be arguing with them. We should be concentrating on that cost. And what are you going to do about the waste? Don't worry about that. Concentrate on the cost of electricity. What are you going to do about proliferation? Don't worry about that. The reason you don't worry about it is we have solutions for all those things that are satisfactory. They were before, they are still, and they will be then. That's the only parameter that matters. And it seems to me that in talks like you just gave, and you have it here, cost of electricity, you need to emphasize that that's the barrier we have to confront. And then I have a second point, which is that for part of that cost issue, we are our own worst enemy. Why? Because we, nobody else, we put in place a regulatory system that costs way too much and that makes the reactors cost way too much. And we continue to idiotically agree that it makes sense. It doesn't make sense. There are things like that that just bother the dickens out of me, and I'm going to give you one example and then I'll shut up, okay? It costs 12 to 15 times as much to pour a pad of concrete underneath a nuclear plant as a pad of concrete underneath a coal plant. And if you go and inspect them, you can't tell the difference. Okay? A concrete in a nuclear plant is about 10% of the cost. It should be 1% of the cost. We're our own worst enemy because no one in this country is addressing that. Neither the concrete people, nor the regulatory people, nor the vendors, nor the AEs, nor anybody. And that's crazy.
Yeah, so I think I generally agree with most everything you said. I definitely think that the cost is going to be the critical component. I think it's important to recognize that the price point may be different in different places. I think some of the interest in microreactors in northern communities is because first product is a different price point, right? So it gets you going on that cost curve. I don't disagree with that. I do think, though, that the public policies that we set, at least in renewables, skew what that price could be, right? So there is a public policy element that will give you a different price point than a pure market economy would be. And to the extent that we want to use that as a driver to push for clean energy, we should, right? And I do think that, I agree that there are communities that would be willing hosts of nuclear. We have them already. I do think you can't ignore the fact that if you approach that community wrong, you can change that conversation, right? And I do worry about that a little bit, right? That people will come in a not very sophisticated way, right? And turn a community that they could have sold. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. It's not. There's not going to be sort of like a favor, right? We're going to build super expensive things just because.
The two things, Bob, I understand. I think that if we count on cost, we're going to be fighting a very steep uphill battle. Not because the concrete cost is too high. It's because natural gas is simply just too cheap for any of the utility people who will be making plans. Can I have the other slide that you have, Todd? The one that's showing China and Russia.
Oh yeah.
Well, I believe that is the motivating force that we have to have. If it is cost, why is the other country can actually build it cheaper than we do? Not in our country because of our cheap natural gas. But if they can build a nuclear power plant in UAE or maybe in Saudi Arabia, cheaper than what we have done, we lose the game. Because this is the technology we developed here. They adopted it, and now they're making much bigger profit than we ever do. Why? Because we thought that it's expensive in our country, so we just give up on not building that. And that's the wrong move. Even though we don't build it here, we should be thinking about building elsewhere, because not everywhere has flat gas the way that we can enjoy. Not everywhere we have wind that Germany can think they can turn into. So many countries could have been needing electricity. If they can win this game and building nuclear power plant cheaper than we do elsewhere, we lose the game.
Yeah.
So, he took my number one issue, but I have a second one. So, I am an AE. I'm in the industry, been in the industry for a while. And the one thing, and I want to know if you have a solution for it, is, I'm probably a Gen 4 engineer. There are no Gen 3s, and the Gen 2s are pretty much gone. The people who train me are pretty much gone. A lot of knowledge went with them. So what can be done to stem that loss to keep it from getting worse? Because a lot of the issues we're having, like at BC Summer, probably wouldn't have happened if those people had been building that reactor. The Gen 2 people have been building that.
Right. So I think, if you're going to get better at doing products, you need to be making them. Right? And that's actually one of the reasons why, if I bet on smaller reactors, because I think there's more places you could build them and drive the cost curves down and get good at that, rather than the giant construction projects. Because it's just not clear to me in the West, with gas prices where they're at, portfolio standards. It's going to take a while before. I made this argument that there's social license issues around renewables. They've barely deployed any in terms of percent of the electricity. It'll be a while before that's a problem. So I don't see in the West a need to build a lot of new gigawatt scale reactors, right? So to me, the one place we have an advantage is we've got these companies that are thinking about different types of products. It could be that with microreactors, there are places where economically there's a higher price point. You get into the market, you start driving down, maybe you help that with portfolio standards, you get good at this. And you don't ignore the fact that countries like Africa don't need a gigawatt scale. They need something of this size and get ahead of the technology curve with US products. Because right now, most of the Russian and Chinese efforts, they're still thinking big reactors. Because in China, that's what they need, right? And I don't think they're thinking some of these other designs. So I think there's a US ingenuity argument here, if we figure out how to do it. But I honestly, I don't know where we're building a lot of the huge ones. I'm not sure. I could be wrong. right? Something could change. We could put a big price on carbon. We could decide that fracking is dangerous and drive the price of natural gas up. But if those things don't change, I struggle to see why we build new big ones. And you're right, we then lose that knowledge base and we're buying it back from Korea eventually. Yeah?
You just mentioned putting a price on carbon. What, in your opinion, are the main obstacles or problems with implementing a carbon tax?
Mainly right now, it's like too many Americans freak out at the sound of the word tax, right? Because it's weird, like we like, there's no way we'd ever do a carbon tax. But we'll agree to a portfolio standard that in the end probably makes the incremental energy costs bigger than if you just put a carbon tax on, right? And I think it's just this it's a political mindset, right? That what an economist think is the obvious thing to do because you're actually taxing at the point of production or use, right? It makes a lot of sense. At the moment, too many people have been convinced that a tax system, you should just freak out. Now, to be honest though, I think some of the initial attempts at that weren't thoughtful enough about where the tax money goes, right? You tax carbon. Everyone that uses petroleum, for instance, pays, right? It's a bigger tax on a lower income person than it is otherwise. So the more thoughtful proposals, I start to say, all right, well, how do I give that back? Tax the carbon, give it back. I don't think some of the early attempts were thoughtful enough about that and therefore convince people, right, that the tax is a bad idea. It's just punishing low income people. So I think a thoughtfully done tax is probably the best pathway to get there. But I think I don't know, it's going to take more public discussion before people don't freak out at the idea of a tax. So we end up doing other things, which probably in an underlying sense are not as smart. Yeah.
So I like your cliff graph you had earlier, right? So it reminds me a little bit on other products, like since you now live near Detroit, right? Carbon factory. So you introduce a new Ford Explorer, and gets sold and reaches a market value and sells, and then eventually it dies off and some other product may take over. But what they do is they reinvent the Ford Explorer at some point, halfway, to extend its lifetime over and over again. You put a new engine in, hybrid, whatever. So would you say that now with small modular reactors, all this, that we are introducing this new technology, like car manufacturers do, or any other manufacturers, to revive that curve?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good idea. Right? I think that's sort of the idea behind small modular reactors. Right? But I actually don't think we're going far enough, and this is not a Todd idea. I heard it first from Eric Ingersoll. But I think as part of that argument, why are we not thinking of things the way our computers work? Why is there not a USB equivalent? Like, why does not every heat exchanger plug into a nuclear system with the exact same thing? Therefore, you can build a better heat exchanger, but you just chunk it in, right? I think it makes sense to me, right? But we don't typically think that way. We think of the one-off design. It's still kind of 1960s-ish feeling. Yes, sir.
So if you have kind of an entrepreneurial ecosystem that's developing a bunch of reactors, it tends to stray away from standardization. And if you look at, the way reactors are now, right, you have a few designs which are fairly common with many instances. So how do you bridge the gap between 75, fledgling designs until a few of them get like a critical mass to actually be deployable?
Yeah, it's a couple ideas. I mean, partly the market will do it, right? If it's clear to investors that you're not getting anywhere, they'll eventually give up on you, right? We have had one of the first. Now, there's two of these entrepreneurial companies I know that have already closed up shop, right? And more will happen just because you're not making progress. Your investors are not going to stick with it, right? So I think that's part of it. I think, to me, the other part of it is, in the history of nuclear, we've always had support from the government. I think most people feel that's probably still necessary. So I've become somewhat obsessed with this idea that if the government is going to participate financially with you, that the primary metric for allocating government funding is how much private funding you can bring to the table. Right? So that we're not doing things that prop up companies that the market is not seeing value in. Now I realize that's a simple thing to say and probably complex in practice, but I've seen too many cases where, as an example, DOE runs a solicitation. They say, company A, we love you. We're going to give you $20 million. And then 2 years later, DOE runs a solicitation. They forget they ever had a relationship with company A. A bunch of stuff comes in, they go, company B, we think you're great, right? DOE's like, congratulations. Company A just got hosed. Their investors think that the Department of Energy just said, we no longer think there's any value in your company. Now, if you ask DOE, were they thinking that when they chose Company B? No, they just thought this year Company B looked okay, right? And so I do think that the federal government needs to be much more thoughtful about what it's doing and how it engages, and what is it doing that drives you towards commercialization of a product, and rather than some of the rando things they do, right? I don't know if I answered your question, but I think part of it works itself out. Part of it, I think we need to be more thoughtful about the way the government spends money, right? So we don't incentivize people continuing on to do something that you're not getting anywhere.
All right, since we're already 15 minutes over our time, thank Todd again.
I want overtime.